Hi, this is Paul. Tried to make a video yesterday, failed. In some ways, these videos are therapy for me. I know with a lot of my conversations, I have a friend here who teaches psychology, and he said, "You seem to be doing therapy on your YouTube conversations." And I'm not a therapist. I do pastoral care. That's what I do sometimes. But these monologues are therapy for me because there are times that I have to sort of talk myself into things, talk myself back into the faith, talk myself back into my job, talk myself away from cynicism, talk myself away from the meaning crisis, talk myself away from all sorts of things that sort of continue to claw at me. Last couple of days, been thinking a lot about the church and the world. I had my conversation yesterday with Andy, and of course, Andy is he's a Christian Reformed church planter. He works in Tucson, Arizona. Probably not a lot of you will watch that conversation because I totally understand. You look for the thumbnail and the title that appeals to you. And Andy's just a local church, part-time, bivocational church planter who loves and cares for a lot of people. And not a lot of people, loves and cares for probably as many people as he can, while he tries to work a business and keep a roof over his family and food on their table. Talking to him, a lot of deep frustration about the impotence of the church. My own deep frustration over my own impotence so often working in contexts. Week after week, I do my rough draft, and the rough drafts are rough drafts. Sometimes the sermons change quite a bit, and I do read the comments, especially on rough drafts, because it's really an opportunity to hear from some of you before the few dozen people at Living Stones hear the sermon. A bunch, some online, some in the room now. So yeah, these monologues are sometimes therapy for me. Sometimes they're rants. Sometimes they're thinking through stuff. And the video that I recorded a lot of but didn't make, I read a lot of Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture, because that's been a super helpful book for me to just sort through all of the political, religious layers that we're dealing with. I think Marsden's book is one of the go-to texts if you want one book to sort of understand American religious history over the last 150 years, at least since the end of the Civil War. And so, yeah, and I talked to Andy. I talked to my friend Mark, who is the pastor of a church planter, and he has an office here with us. And I talked to my other buddies in the cluster. I talked to you all online, and some of the best conversations I don't share, just because they're not appropriate to share. But they're when people get honest about their lives, and those of you who have had conversations with me that some of those I've really wanted to post, but you say no. And I totally agree. I don't want to post any conversations that will run the risk of getting you in trouble. But the church and the world. Great comment on the Enriquez convo that gets at a bunch of sort of helping me think through and feel through this moment in American church life. The elephant notion in the middle of this conversation is commitment in practice. Commitment, caring. Look how often this comes up in Heidegger. I mean, it's almost all there is. Kierkegaard believed that modernity strips away commitment by increasingly occupying the aesthetic sphere at the expense of the religious and ethical spheres. Boy, I'll tell you, when I read that in the comments, and I never get to all the comments, but YouTube sort of pulls me up comments I haven't commented on, and I read through as many comments as I can, at least especially the first level comments. Sometimes you guys go deep into a thread back and forth, and I don't get to all of those. But, when I read this, I thought, wow, yeah. One of the things that I noticed early on as I was a young adult thinking about the Christian Reformed Church and what it would mean to be reformed and total depravity, that we sort of do the transactions. This is extremely Protestant. We sort of do the transactions in our head, and then it's done, and that's spiritual. But what it really is psychic or thought based. We don't do it out in the world. And as I mentioned before, you look at Vervaeke's Religion That Isn't a Religion, and you look at the guys in the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server, and they're all into practices. And that's, there's real reasons for that. You look at someone like The Body Keeps the Score, a great book about trauma. And so often people have to work through. It's not just talking. And the therapist in my church does EMDR with the lights going back and forth. I remember when she first discovered that and started working that, I'm like, how does that work? And, she explained it to me, and helping people with trauma. But again, this sentence, Kierkegaard believed that modernity strips away commitment by increasingly occupying the aesthetic sphere at the expense of the religious and the ethical sphere, which Hubert Dreyfus updates by identifying the internet as offering serial aesthetic experience Kierkegaard was describing in the 1840s. Wow, is that true? Now, again, Kierkegaard is writing at sort of the peak of, it's not really peak modernity yet, but sort of peak Protestantism in Denmark. And it's getting increasingly decadent, and Kierkegaard comes in and just isn't having it. And Kierkegaard has lived a strange life. Julian actually did a conversation on the Randos channel with the author of the biography of Kierkegaard that I read. I thought it was a great biography. Kierkegaard's insight was that only the religious sphere engenders commitment. In other words, we watch something on the news and we feel ourselves either, down with one side of the political ravine or the other, and we feel ourselves justified because we stood with Trump, or at least stood instead of Trump because he stayed in the White House, or we stood with Biden, or we were with Hillary, or we believe in Jesus in our head. And even if we're the kind of Protestant that never goes to church, I can be a Christian just by staying home, by believing Jesus in my head. And maybe I do a few things, but that's deeply Protestant, that's the whole transaction happens right up here in my brain. And Kierkegaard's other great insight was to understand that the Enlightenment's belief in the sovereignty of rational debate would dominate the public square, and therefore perfect policy to be wrong-headed. This is because every problem can be examined by any number of points of view, which results in endless armchair analysis at the expense of commitment to practice. And so, in other words, it's university. You sit and you talk, and this is my channel. Now, again, as I often say, YouTube is talk. This is all this medium can afford. I can't reach out and touch you. I can't do any of that. I'm on a screen. I'm a being of light. And, if you're sitting here thinking with me, that's why I say, it's really hard to be a Christian and not be connected with a church. With all of its messiness and all of its isness, that a real community is, and be committed to that and participate in it and give to it and struggle with it. That's why, you can get stuff from me on YouTube, but I can't be church for you. I can give you a message, I can give you a sermon, but that's why I always have those yeah buts with what I'm doing. Kierkegaard once described this as Hegel giving us a map of Europe when all we needed and desired was to find our way around our own village. And then this is a critique of Greg and John. How do Greg and John engender commitment to their vision for the future? Will cognitive science and a dash of meditation do it? I don't think so. It's the practice that gives words their sense. Wittgenstein. And obviously a very sharp commenter. I didn't recognize him. These are some of the first comments on this video that I'd seen. But, profound and helping me. I didn't know this about Dreyfus or Kierkegaard, but it made perfect sense. This living in our heads that we're doing, and maybe we vote every 4 years or we make a political donation, but for the most part, I think part of the reason America doesn't descend into civil war is that we're just having the Civil War in our brains, and we just simply keep it going. It's just doing all this living up here. And then a regular email writer to me, he sends me a lot of good stuff. Often what he sends me is our notes from Bruce Charlton's Notions, which is a very interesting blog. And I don't know anything about this guy, but obviously a very smart, very well-read man. And he sent me this after pondering my conversation with Brett and Cale about, the Roman Catholics. So this blog post from Sunday, February 21. 2 options for being a Christian here and now, and one of them is not viable. We have in the West experienced a couple of centuries of high-level critique and rejection of Christianity, perhaps most famously, influentially by Nietzsche, who blamed in practice Christianity for the attitude of passivity, guilt, self-hatred, and covert suicide that now dominates the West, even though it is several generations since Christianity was excluded from a significant public discourse in the West. The implication is that either we go back to pre-modern traditional Christianity, along with everything that might entail such a monarchy, top-down rule by the church, agrarian society, etc. And again, this followed on the video that I did with the Roman Catholics. And so, when I listen to, when I read Chesterton or listen to Mary or talk to some Roman Catholics, you have that sense that we can go back again. And when I talk to the Orthodox, we'll go back before the Roman Catholic. We'll go all the way back to the Church Fathers. The implication is that either we go back to pre-modern traditional Christianity, along with everything that might entail, such as monarchy, top-down rule by the church, agrarian societies, etc. And again, look at my... I don't love all my conversations like I love my children all the same. Sometimes I have conversations that just stand out. And that moment when Sally, just talks about sitting in her front yard with her Orthodox study Bible on her lap because she's angry with the bishop because he's making everyone wear masks. And she's like, I'm a Protestant again. Really? Can we go back that way? Can we go back to monarchy? Can we go back to agrarian societies? Can we do that? Or else we remake the philosophy of Christianity, which entails making a distinction between actual Christianity and all traditional attempts to describe, explain, instantiate, and implement it. It means re-examining the assumptions that Greek-Roman philosophy within which traditional Christianity is explained. It means re-examining the assumptions that Christianity be church-led and church-controlled. That genie's out of the bottle. How many people they're Christians in their heads? And maybe they do a few things, but that's, maybe that's ultimate Protestantism. Re-examining the usually historical understanding of Christian, several assumptions underlying the assertion of the primacy of Scripture and very idea of tradition itself. In other words, the choices are traditional Christianity in some version or another, and remaking the medieval world, or else Romantic Christianity in one form or another, and using this as the basis of an unknown, unknowable future. But if we conclude that the traditional path is both overall undesirable and actually impossible, there will only be one choice: Romantic Christianity. And a little asterisk on impossible. I shall not attempt to persuade anybody of this, but I tried several years to think through the implications honestly and found the project to be literally impossible, as well as harmful to embark upon. This despite my being perfectly clear that the medieval traditional world was objectively better. That's what Lewis thought too. More God-aligned, more good, more motivated to be in accordance with divine creation than is the world of 2021. Much better. Until you understand how these two convictions, better and also bad and possible, are simultaneously possible, then you do not understand the point I am making. Whether or not you agree with it is another matter. And I think I understand his point. Now, what does he mean by romantic Christianity? Now, actually, I read this yesterday and I thought a lot about that. And, in many ways, it's Protestantism and Romanticism put together. And maybe in some ways, part of the reason Romanticism flies in Protestant places such as Geneva and Rousseau is because it's a religion in our heads and not on the table and in the bread and in the water. And, well, it's in the words. So, but then I noticed, Romantic Christianity, there's a link there. The lineage of Romantic Christianity in England, a sort of manifesto, and this was back in 2018. To define Romanticism with precision has proved impossible because it is a movement, a phase of human consciousness. But to those who feel it will recognize it when they see it. To be included on this list, one must both be romantic and Christian, and someone whose work I personally respond to. William Blake, William Wordsworth, Coleridge. Then came several generations during which the Romantics were not Christians, and the Christians were not romantic. Exceptions include George MacDonald and G.K. Chesterton, who link between the early Romantic Christians and the Inklings. Both of these I somewhat like, especially G.K. Chesterton, but I'm unable to engage wholeheartedly. And then he's got the Inklings, Charles William, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Owen Barfield, and William Arkell. Current representatives whom I am aware of include Jeremy Nadler, Terry Boardman, the Albion Awaken bloggers, William Wildblood, John Fitzgerald, and myself. I don't know any of those people. Comment. The influence of Rudolf Steiner is evident, since although anthroposophists were extremely rare in England, Barfield, Nadler, and Boardman are all of that ilk. Now it's very interesting that they're around Northern California in the form of Waldorf schools. And most of what's going on, at least in the Waldorf school where my wife teaches, is in practice tied to Steiner in some ways. They use some Steiner methods, and there are private Waldorf schools that are much more that way. And I'm going to read a blog post about Steiner a little bit because he does come in. This is evidence that Romanticism fits most comfortably within heterodox Christianity, despite that Tolkien, Roman Catholic, and Lewis, Church of England, were Orthodox in their practice. Indeed, Blake, Barfield, much of his life, Arkell, and most of the currently alive people are, I believe, essentially unaffiliated Christians, whose religious and spiritual practice is mostly and in principle individual rather than communal. And again, church attendance reaches its peak during the Cold War, and after the Cold War, many who had either been to church during the Cold War or grew up in church would simply identify as evangelical or Christian or lapsed Catholic or Jack Mormons, and they're just sort of, there in their heads having their relationship with Jesus or their relationship with God, and that's currently morphed into spiritual but not religious, and they become Verizon Lisa, and they're talking to the universe. The Steiner link is also important because Germany, in the sense of the Central European German-speaking culture, included Austria and Switzerland, and some culturally Germanic cities are not nowadays in Germany, was the other great origin of Romanticism with Herder, I can't say these German names, Goethe, Schiller, etc. However, until Steiner's conversion in about 1898, the German Romantic literary tradition was not really Christian. An exception was Novalis, the father of Romantic Christianity in Germany. It might also be argued that C.G. Jung, 1875 to 1961, is also a part of the German tradition of Romantic Christianity. And when I read that, I thought, this is really making some sense. Although, as so often with Jung, his status as a Christian is ambiguous, sort of like Jordan Peterson. Overall, I would say that by the end of his life, Jung should indeed be regarded as a Christian. There are not many on this list because I don't know of many romantic Christians. It is a job still to be done by each individual, again, since romantic Christianity must be experiential. Knowing about it does not suffice. Again, if you look at my Friday question and answer, the first question and answer had seeing the light or seeing along the light. And I talked about inside and outside. Now, the part of the difficulty of doing my recordings on Discord is that my answers are, maybe I'll start recording them on this computer too, just so I get a better copy. But my answers are, the sound recording isn't very good. I thought of making a clip from it, because that whole inside and outside, I should probably do a whole video on it, because that became sort of the first 30-minute answer to a question on there. Mainstream Christianity still tends to regard traditionalism as the safe path to salvation and theosis as too risky, and romanticism is about theosis. Well, that's an interesting comment. But for the romantic Christians, there is no safe path in the modern world. And traditionalism has in fact become impossible, judged at the deepest level of motivation, as well as suboptimally desirable. That's, of course, his view. We feel that in modern conditions, salvation requires theosis, and I think that gets deeply into Charles Taylor, and I still really have to digest a lot of Andrew Root stuff, but I think he makes a real point there. So a purely salvation orientation can only be a kind of rescue procedure, because ultimately romanticism is not a reaction against the Industrial Revolution, modernity, and bureaucracy. Rather, romanticism is a positive path of divine destiny concerned with human evolutionary development of consciousness. And we're getting into Barfield. The aim of romantic Christianity is implicitly to attain a divine form of consciousness that Barfield termed final participation as the primary goal of moral life at this era of history. In different words, the aim is to restore the unity of life, including the healing of the split between mind and matter, subjective and objective, to cure the malaise of alienation. Romantic Christianity is both theoretically metaphysical and practical, experiential. Ideas and living both need to change, because otherwise the two aspects will be contradictory, at war, and therefore unattainable in life. The romantic Christian demands that life be Christian as its roots and frame, and also demand that life, including Christianity, be romantic. Therefore, it cannot accept the ultimate of primary necessity of system, organization, institution, bureaucracy. And so if you look at my conversation with Cale and with Brett, they're struggling with that, especially in a Roman Catholic context where you can see why this tension over Vatican II with respect to this question of, is salvation only found within an institution? Now, does that mean today what it meant in the 12th century? Does it mean today what it meant for Augustine? These are hard questions. Love and creativity are the goal, and creativity as located in thinking, and thinking regarded as universal and primary. He also had a link here, a blog by Kevin McCall. I'd never read this blog before. Seeing the Old in a New Way, and there's a lot of Tolkien and Lewis stuff on this blog. So yeah, all the same characters here. I believe in the evolutionary development of consciousness, meaning that human consciousness has changed and evolved over time. Further, I believe that the proper response to modernity is not to go back to an earlier stage, but to go through modernity by developing new ways of thinking. But one thing I always try to do is imagine what this would look like in detail. We're sort of stuck in our head. How does it work? One big way, I think, has happened through history is that people find new insights and new ways of understanding by looking at what is old through the lens of a new way of thinking. Now, if you get back to my thinking about Tom Holland and history and the 1990s, and that's in the video I didn't make. The video I didn't finish and probably will never see the light of day because I thought it was so bad. It was too bad even for me and my channel. It's too bad even for my therapy sessions. But so he gets into in this blog a little bit of art, and I got to make sure that I include this blog in the notes here because you can link to it. Well, it's not, the link isn't up there anymore. It's on my blog under Steiner. One big way to do this is, but again, we're still thinking here. One example is painting. I believe that the history of painting in the 19th century shows the development of consciousness that Rudolf Steiner says took place at that time. In the 19th century, there were many painters skilled in realism and detail, exemplified by such paintings as John Constable's 1825 painting Salisbury Cathedral at the Bishop's Grounds. Lovely painting. In his lecture, The Material and the Task of Anthroposophy, Steiner wrote, "It was in the middle and second half of the 19th century that materialism had its period of greatest development. Whatever one's opinion of Rudolf Steiner, in many ways, this was a century where the development of the physical was at its high point." And I think really at its high point in terms of thinking about it. Because again, modernity sort of reaches its peak right before the First World War, and the First World War begins its destruction. And we can understand the physical more broadly to mean the objective world, as well as the skills in arts and crafts and manufacturing. This was also the heyday of the naturalistic and realistic novel. Then, with Impressionism, we see something change. The artist now attempts to depict the impression of a scene. Painting moves inward to show the subjective. An example is Alfred Sisley's view of the Canal of St. Martin. This matches the development outlined by Steiner. At the high point of materialistic consciousness in the 19th century, human beings were supposed to move towards a consciousness that recognized the realm of the spiritual. But there were two crucial functions. This new consciousness would not recapitulate the old, where the spiritual was perceived by the senses. Now we're into Barfield here, because where does Barfield probably get some of his stuff? But from Steiner, wind and spirit. How are they the same? Now, there's these splits that happen as we go through time. I talked about that in some of my previous videos, and you can't go back through the split. You've got that with the spiritual and the supernatural and the natural. You've got all of those splits along the way, and you can't go the other ways back through the splits. And so Steiner notes, okay, we've come now to a divide, and you can't just go back to the divide. And so as Barfield is looking towards final participation, and this is what Charlton is talking about in terms of the romantic Christianity. This new consciousness would not recapitulate the old, where the spiritual was perceived by the senses. Instead, the spiritual would be perceived in consciousness. Now think that through. Wind and spirit. Can you see spirit? I see the trees moving. Look at what Jesus says in John 3 to Nicodemus. Furthermore, this new development must be chosen. It cannot be forced. It's very Protestant. It's very, the place of the will is active in this. It's something that must be chosen. It's something that must be embraced. It is only natural that such development would be expressed in art. Another way of development in art is using modern realistic paintings techniques to render the legendary or mythical. And so when I look at someone like Tom Holland and his spiritual journey, This seems to be what he's doing. When I look at Jordan Peterson, this seems to be what he's doing. This is trying to get back, but it's not really back. It's trying to recapture what was lost by moving forward, by taking your clues from the past. If you think about it, this is taking the legendary or mythic and recast not as foggy or vague, but taking up the rational consciousness. A good example is Frederick Sandy's painting Queen Eleanor. Since the medieval queen is depicted, but in such a detailed way that it is like we are seeing her in person. Both the development in painting were reflected in novels. The move towards the subjective is reflected in writers like Dostoevsky with the psychological novel, while the depiction of the legendary in a modern manner of fantasy and other imaginary fiction. Another example of this is critical history, the view of history as science. Yesterday, I was reading an encyclopedia article about Isaac Newton's occult studies. The article discussed how Newton studied biblical prophecy, ancient chronology, and sacred geometry of the Temple of Solomon. The article states, as a biblical scholar, Newton was initially interested in sacred geometry of Solomon's temple, such as golden sections, conic sections, spirals, orthographic projection, and other harmonious constructions, but he also believed that the dimensions and proportions represented more. He noted that the temple's measurements given in the Bible are mathematical problems related to solutions for pi and the volume of a hemisphere. In a larger sense, that there are references to the size of the earth and man's place and proportion in it. That's what temples did. And again, we've lost that understanding of what a temple is, and you can read some of John Walton's stuff on Genesis 1, where he goes back and says that's a temple text. How does the temple function? In all three of these areas, Newton is applying modern critical, historical, and scientific thinking towards the Bible and other ancient sources. I'm not endorsing any of Newton's conclusions on these matters, but his example shows how we have here an example to tease out new knowledge from old sources by applying new ways of thinking to them. And I think in a lot of ways, this is exactly what Jordan Peterson did with his biblical series. As a whole, I think the project of critical rational history has provided many insights, one being chronology. Even as late as Newton's day, the dates of many ancient historical events were not known accurately. We have been able to order and catalog the years of many events and so gain new insights into history. Yet another example is Plato and the Neoplatonists. Many modern scholars dismiss the Neoplatonists who added to Plato's teaching. However, the impression I get is that some of Neoplatonists themselves would say that everything they teach was already in Plato, and that this was characteristic of ancient peoples. Now, I read a fair amount in the video I didn't make. I read a fair amount of Marsden's book. And in some ways, even the dispensationalists are sort of playing like this. And the rise of dispensationalism in its opposing post-millennial, both sides consider themselves evangelical. So you can't really use that label. And we're going to get that later in this video. It's all of this playing with the ancient stuff now with new modern tools. And I am not a dispensationalist, and I think as a way of reading the Bible, it was a bit of a catastrophe. And I think Marsden shows that quite well, but respectfully, this book isn't anti-dispensational, but he shows the role that dispensationalism played in basically the main political division we have today. So this idea that the Neoplatonic ideas were inside of Plato, whereas scholars go back and read Plato and say, I don't see them. These seem to be new developments, but the Neoplatonists saw them as having these developments, let's riff on New Testament nomenclature, in Plato. And this was characteristic of ancient people. When something was indeed a new development, they would say that it was contained in the original all along. And I think in many ways, part of what we struggle to understand, and I think this is what dispensationalism got wrong, with reading the Old Testament was they saw things in the Old Testament, but they were approaching it as moderns, okay? But when you look at, for example, when New Testament authors quote the Old Testament and are making a point with it, a lot of us moderns look at that and say, I don't see the point. They were saying that these things are in the Old, and that's pretty much exactly what they say of Jesus. So to stick with the Greek approach to mathematics was truly something new. They discovered mathematics from the Egyptians and the Chaldeans, but recast the earlier discoveries in a new light by looking on them not just as facts, but as theorems, statements to be proven. No doubt the earlier civilizations had reasoning they used to arrive at their conclusions, but the Greeks made a study of proof and thereby brought forth a new development of mathematics. Now, it may very well be, now Strawn, I'm talking to you, Strawn. Strawn still hasn't given me permission to share any of our conversations, but Strawn always sends me Egyptian stuff, and I never quite know what I'm looking at, but there's some of that in there. The Egyptians probably worked things out physically and noted patterns and relationships, and the Greeks sort of implement the move to the head. And that's why I often say, we can throw a lot of things on the Protestant Reformation, but this evolution of consciousness that Barfield looks at happens again and again and again in cycles and cycles and cycles. And Tom Holland brings some of this out, but it happens in the Hebrew prophets. I want obedience, not sacrifice. There's some of that parabolic application that happens at that point. And it happens with Jesus. It's not what you put into your mouth that makes you unclean. It's what's in your heart. I mean, and so when the Protestant reformers come along, they're finding it in the text too. But again, we're trying to connect heaven and earth here. And so we just kind of keep going back and forth, bumping up and down against the bottom. We hit too low, we hit too high, and we're sort of playing pong between them. One last example is J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, both of them wanting to write stories that would incorporate what they loved from mythology. But they did not simply rewrite myths. Tom Shipley has written in The Road to Middle-earth that The Lord of the Rings is in some ways very different from the ancient stories such as Beowulf. Frodo's quest to destroy the One Ring forces him to do battle in a subtle manner very different from the out-and-out confrontation of Beowulf and Grendel. And that's right. The parts of the book, and especially the movies, that people really hate are Frodo and Sam. Why? Frodo and Sam are fighting a very Protestant battle. Well, what do I mean by that? Don't Catholics fight that battle? Of course they do. But the battle's all on the inside. The battle is psychological. And so what happens with Tolkien and Lord of the Rings is that it's a very psychological battle. Now, of course, every spiritual battle we fight is deeply psychological. But you see that in Frodo's quest very clearly, as opposed to a lot of other things where all of the drama is on the outside, not the inside. Now we're getting back to Charlton's, Charlton or Carlton, I don't know which it is for him, his romantic Christianity. And again, that word's going to be debated and correctly so. It's his term. But the point is to try to understand what he means. Tolkien recognized that he could not actually live and think as a man of the past and did not try to. He took up what was good from the past in his own consciousness and brought forth something completely new, but that was still an organic development from what had come before. Likewise, in Lewis's The Hideous Strength, angels and Merlin exist alongside a technocratic organization. And again, this shows Tolkien was horrified by Narnia of Lewis. You've got all that mixed up, and Lewis is like, so what? You've got angels and Merlin existing with a technocratic modern organization. In this book and others in the Space Trilogy, Lewis gives much thought to such things that might appear in the modern world and how modern people might think of them. One reason why this way of bringing fourth something, I think fourth instead of four, fourth something new is good is because it is development rather than mere change. And that's where you get from the inside. You're developing it. Neoplatonism is inside Plato. There's always this fight about, well, did Jesus start a church? Well, in some ways, a church was inside the discipleship that Jesus does to his disciples. It's going to have to come out as communal. And that's exactly what Carlton is wrestling with. Can it really be communal? I think part of what we're seeing in the meaning crisis is it must be communal. It can't help but be communal, but we're still dealing with this disconnection of heaven and earth. When an acorn grows into an oak, this is a dramatic shift, but it follows nature rather than going against it. And organic development does not destroy the past to bring forth something new. Thus, this is one way forward for us. It has been used by ancients and modern people. We want to move forward in consciousness as we can take something good from the past and try to develop what is good in a new way. So, how do people, and I would say that people are naturally doing this. And I think this is a lot of what we're seeing. Twitter is a dangerous and powerful thing, and I find myself misstepping sometimes. But this morning I was just reflecting on what I saw, and so I tweeted, "Twitter, I come for the outrage. It makes me feel important, vital, and alive." And then I used a little GIF from Portlandia. Yeah. Why? Why is AI messing with us, and why are these signals getting amplified in the pandemic and by social media and in our culture? This is in many ways sort of romantic participation, but romantic participation in the meaning crisis. Why so angry? Why are you look at what are, I think, quasi-religious movements, and they want anger from their people. They want outrage from their people, and they want this to somehow be motivating action along a certain line that they're looking for the people to act in. But again, back to the comment in the comment about Kierkegaard in Caring. The elephant notion in the middle of this conversation is commitment in practice. Kierkegaard believed that modernity strips away commitment by increasingly occupying the aesthetic sphere at the expense of the religious and the ethical spheres, which Hubert Dreyfus updated by identifying the internet as offering serial aesthetic experience to Kierkegaard. That's what these movements are doing. These are serial aesthetic experiences, and anger is almost always the driving motivation, because anger and fear, very powerful motivations to action. But the actions that are being elicited are designed to participate in something. Participate in the civil rights movement. Participate in the American Revolution. Participate in your country. You must participate in something larger than yourself that gives you identity and meaning and all of these things. Anger is one of the few enchanted feelings left to many who long for meaningful participation. So go storm the Capitol. I'll be with you, but in the White House. You get to participate in a larger morality play that is splashed across your religious political network of choice. Your vote counts. Your voice counts. You are a God that brings justice to the world. And so when we watch the Avengers or Batman, we participate in it in a very Protestant way. And then we dress in Batman. We dress in superheroes. I've been watching Tattoo Master with my kids. We get them tattooed on our arms. This is the romantic participation. Most of it passive because, well, once you actually act, well, then there are consequences. But a lot of it in your head, fairly consequence-free. Now, again, back to my conversation with Andy, churches are proxies for the broader culture war. I see this right now. It's like split right down the middle. And actually, if you're not interested in the church planting stuff, just tune in for the last 10 or 15 minutes of that conversation, because if I talk again with Andy, that's where I want to start back, because Andy had a lot of good insights in that, and I really appreciated it. He said, 10% of my church, if I say we should wear a mask, will, you're trampling on my liberty. And 10% say, I'm not going to see you until 2022 because, double mask is not good enough. I want to wear 4. I'm going to come in a hazmat suit after I get my vaccine. And the other 80% are all split in the middle. And they're leaving. And, I'm talking to more and more people who are saying things like, I can't go to that church anymore because every sermon is woke stuff. And I noticed a comment in the Greg Enriquez thing, once he said white privilege, I'm out of there. Okay. You're pretty reactive. And, you're just mirroring the two sides here. How reactive can you be? I'm reactive to everything since 1619. Oh, is that when racism started? I'm reactive to anything woke. Okay, well, good luck navigating. If you cover yourself with buttons, people are going to push them. And if you really want to grow up and master this world, you're going to have to figure out how to deal strategically with who's ever on the other side of whatever divide you're working on. So people are leaving church because every church is woke. And then a high-profile black pastor from Washington, D.C. said, I think the anti-CRT people, they're the real destructive ones. And that's not a particularly woke pastor who said that. But and I'm hearing more and more stories of churches that are just sort of they're prickly, they're on edge, but are they actually going to leave each other? Well, leaving church is pretty easy, but all of the fights are in their heads. And I'm watching denominational leadership tacking sort of woke light, and this is across the Protestant board. And I look at them and I think, is that the safe corporate choice? Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's the safe corporate choice because, and this is part of what how I really get cynical about all that talk is that all of this well-meant enthusiasm for people of color, et cetera, it stays in your head. You're not actually helping anyone. I don't see it. I don't, if all of these do-gooders were walking through my neighborhood handing out money to poor people, I'd notice. No, it's not happening. It's all in our heads. And these are the wars that we fight. Yesterday I saw this article. Staff of CRC Justice Ministries feel threatened. Christian Reformed Church Executive Colin Watson. Now, the Christian Reformed Church is a small place. Colin Watson, before he moved to Grand Rapids to take the number 2 job, which has become the number 1 job in the denomination, is an African-American man from Paterson, New Jersey. The head of CRC Justice Ministry, I was the best man in his wedding. This is a small group. These are people I know and care about and trust. These are good people. Christian Reformed Church Executive Director Colin Watson Sr. informed the Council of Delegates at its recent meeting that there's been an increase in the number of offensive comments as well as racist posts on social media and anonymous letters and postcards, leaving staff concerns for their safety. I don't know how to evaluate this. I was moving a homeless person's cart I had already moved the cart off and I wasn't letting him bring him back on once. And I had another guy with me who hadn't been around me in this thing. And the homeless guy was, telling me how all kinds of unspeakable things he was going to do me. And the guy with me said, that man just threatened your life. I said, yeah, he does it every day. He's always threatening my life. Could he take it seriously? Maybe one day, but I don't know. Is this safetyism? A little bit later in the article, I appreciated this article. Delegate Bruce DeCam, Northern classist, Northern Michigan, probably more conservative classist, wondered if staff perception of what was happening might not be other people's perception. The question we haven't really asked was not what's happening, but is not what is happening, but why. I think that needs to be explored a bit more. Why people react the way they do to the Office of Social Justice is doing. Something is happening because people are frustrated. So you can go to the Office of Social Justice on the CRC website and you can read the kinds of things that they post about. People who like the OSJ are frustrated, and people who don't like the OSJ are frustrated because, to a certain degree, this entire thing is just built to increase anger and frustration and make people think they're doing things because things are in their head. And I see so much of what denominational leadership do is just sort of antagonizing the whole thing. After 9/11, people asked, and I know this was controversial. People said, what did we do to have these people who flew planes into buildings hate us so much? And that reminded me of Jordan Peterson making the observation of the Jews that, when the calamities came down on them, they said to themselves, what did we do to anger God so badly? And Jordan Peterson makes the point, that's a really productive question. Now you can get kind of crazy, sick, and obsessed with those questions, and I watch people with OCD and lots of other people do so, but it's a very productive question. But what's interesting is that we'll ask this question of people who drive airplanes into buildings, but we won't ask it from Islam, but we won't ask it of fellow Christians. And we won't pause and say, these are denominational ministries that work on donations. And I think maybe that's part of the answer, because now the Office of Social Justice has victim status. So double down and you're giving money to them. Now, true confessions here, I never read the banner. Why don't I read the banner? Because I have very little confidence that what's in the banner will be of interest to me. You're a Christian Reformed minister. The banner used to be, 50 years ago, came out weekly, was a vital part of the denomination's life. That's gone away. And again, back to, I mentioned the 150th anniversary of the Christian Reformed Church. James Scott in Iowa writes a piece that basically says the CRC long ago, sort of when they took down their walls and stopped their proto-Benedict option, the CRC long ago lost control of its own weather. What do I mean by its own weather? Its own story, its own narrative. We're just sort of proxies of the bigger culture wars. And so, and then I look at, okay, what are all the editorials about? What are all the pieces about? What is evangelicalism? Not me. I'm not evangelical. Now, that's a bigger, complicated thing in the Christian Reformed Church. God is not colorblind. And so then it's like, okay, well, I have to take the editor who's Chinese Canadian and pit him against, say, Coleman Hughes and say, who has more authority about matters of this? Now I'm lost in an oppression Olympics or an intersectional nightmare. And I actually read that God is not colorblind and didn't think it was a bad editorial. But we're just beating the drums on these issues. Why? Because this is the religiosity of our day. These are the two dominant religions in our culture. And it's not Christianity on either side. It's participation in the right side of history, or participation in resistance and freedom. And these are the religions we're living in. And the denominations are just paupers, proxies. And I think, You're supposed to have the word of God, but you're sucking on the teats of mass media of one side or the other. Or just carrying the water for them. This is the best we can do. Yeah, the walls are down. We're overrun. Woke light is the safe corporate move right now. And the whole thing about speaking truth to power. Okay, they got Hobby Lobby and Chick-fil-A. Hobby Lobby and Chick-fil-A versus Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, all the major networks, all the telecoms. Speaking truth to power, this woke light stuff is prophetic. It's not prophetic, it's the mainstream. You don't have another narrative, and you don't understand how Jesus navigated his culture war. Well, you can look at my rough drafts. You know the kinds of things I preach. I think this path is a road to destruction, but it's not a new road to destruction. Ironically, it's the mirror image of Trump, who, the Christian Reformed Church is probably 60, 70% reliably Republican, maybe 75%. So, 60, 75% of CRC people probably voted for Trump. And then, as is usual in denominations, your intelligentsia, your people at the top, they're more progressive than the rank and file, the people down below who are paying their bills. You've got all this tension between them. But it's just preaching to the base. It's how Trump made it through his 4 years. Don't care about the other side, preach to the base. Don't care about the other side, preach to the base. You're not going to have a denomination after COVID. You can find other articles about ministry shares are down. I wonder why. Churches themselves, and again, the point of this video is not a rant against the Christian Reformed Church, which I love, which I've been a part of all my life and intend to be a part of all my life, which I'm deeply loyal to. If I wasn't loyal to it, I wouldn't care. But I do. These are my friends. These are my people. This is my church. And I'm desperately concerned for it. And I don't know what to do. But just beating the participatory drum, and we're participating in these political religions, and that's what we're doing. And you gain status by beating the drum for your drive because they're your side, because they'll vote you up the hierarchy. I look now, April 19, 2018, before another synod, I did a video conversation with, because the two guys at the bottom were sending an overture to Senate about stop political lobbying. I mean, the conservatives in the denomination have been upset with the OSJ for a very long time. And I remember being at one synod when the advisory committee sort of had a business as usual recommendation, if you know the in and out works of synod. It was voted down. I just knew things are changing. Things are changing. And then, okay, there'll be an advisory committee over the Office of Social Justice, and they'll try to help it not be too much of an echo chamber for one side of the political aisle, although they do some things on abortion now and then. And then, so the other side was watching who's going to be on that advisory committee. And again, the CRC is a small group. Any people we know? Yeah, it was people that they knew, but it was like, no, that advisory committee isn't going to do a thing. The Christian Reformed Church is probably now below 200,000 people. When my father came back from a home missions meeting, they set a goal of 400,000 by 2000. We'll be lucky if we're around in 2050. In the 1960s and 70s, it started to reach out beyond the Dutch, the descendants of Dutch immigrants. And of course, my father's congregation and this congregation planted around the same time. These were forerunners of the new, diverse, ethnically diverse Christian Reformed Church, racial reconciliation movement. That's what this church was. That's what my father's church was. That's been the side of the denomination I've been in all my life. But it was always a matter of recapturing the vision of the book of Revelation. And I don't know if that is even the goal now. It's a perpetual tug of war between the mainline and evangelical in the CRC. And as you know, often some of the top levels tend to be more mainline-ish, and some of the rank and file tend to be more evangelical. And now with all this participatory, now we're not even in church together. And as churches get increasingly separated, we have red church and blue church. It's just making things worse. The Reformed Church of America, which is the church the Christian Reformed Church split off of, but in many ways a sister denomination, the heirs of the state church in the Netherlands, one of the oldest European institutions in North America, they are splitting up. And whereas the Christian Reformed Church was always sort of moderate in the middle, the RCA was smaller but quite a bit more extreme. This East was far more mainline, and the West was far more evangelical. And now basically after fighting for 25 years about same-sex marriage, they're all going their own way. We're all Protestants now. God talks to you. You find a church to match who or what God is to you. And again, the last few minutes of my conversations with Andy, you would think that, well, people go to their pastors to find out what God thinks. Now, most of the time, they've pretty much made up their mind what they're going to do, and if the pastor doesn't somehow validate the conclusion they've come to, well, I'm going to find a pastor who does. Pastors as quivering masses of availability. And this is where I get, again, back to my conversation with Brett and with Cale. Maybe we're not a church at all. Maybe we're just a religious service provider. And when AT&T doesn't give me what I want, I hop over to Verizon, who's looking to make a better deal. Because churches are all about growing and, maybe growing at the expense of anyone else. And meanwhile, they're all falling through the floor. As I mentioned in a previous video, we're mediated. The multiplicity of competing mediated enchantment vendors. And, I very much wanted Jesus and John Wayne to tell me how white evangelicals corrupted a faith and fractured a nation. I wanted to know what pure faith had been corrupted, and I wanted to know what unified nation had been split. Well, actually, you can find the answers to those questions not in Jesus and John Wayne, but in fundamentalism and American culture. Because Marsden walks through the history, does so with a lot of fairness. And again, this article, How the Civil Rights Movement Converted Liberal White Protestants to Secularism. That's exactly right. Now they found their religious moment in the movement, and so now churches are sort of competing with that. Maybe with our smoke machine and our skinny jeans pastors and our awesome music that lifts you to the heights of heaven, or maybe our church is really down for, I've had people come into this church and listen to a few sermons and, Pastor, I don't understand why this church isn't twice as big. You'll figure out why this church isn't twice as big soon enough. Then pretty quickly, they'll come at me. Pastor, you should be what? I should be what? Because it's one of two things, right? I should be either carrying the water for this side of the culture war or carrying the water for that side of the culture war. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to have a church that has everybody voting one way or everybody voting the other way and no one would ever come in. I'm not going to do it. How am I going to navigate a culture war? I'm going to read the Gospels and I'm going to try and figure out how Jesus did it. And that's how I'm going to do it. Only problem is, how that story almost ends. So if you see me hanging naked on a cross, mission accomplished. But, I look at Holland and Peterson and they're looking for an enchanted home. That's what they are. They're I should have put that picture in. Hang on a second. Christianity has profoundly impacted our moral matrix, our expectations, our storyverse. This culture war we're in the middle of is a Christian culture war, and I love how Tom Holland brings that to bear. Both sides are heirs of the same thing. Marsden brings that to bear. Both sides are heirs of the winners of the Civil War. And the South, fundamentalism starts in the North, and the South appropriates it. Read Marsden. It's all in there. But what do Holland and Jordan want? I think of this scene in The Matrix where Cypher cuts a deal with Agent Smith and says, I want back in the Matrix. And he sits there at that dinner and he looks at that steak and says, I know this is just coding, but it tastes delicious. So plug me back into the Matrix and make me rich. And, I want to play. I want to participate. I want to get back in. Cypher wanting back into the Matrix, but doubtful that it's true. I think that's exactly where they are. Now, of course, I'm not aligning them with Cypher, who's sort of the Judas Iscariot of Jesus Neo, but, Jewish Iscariot who fails. But I think that's where we're at. That's what we're doing. It's all romantic. We're looking for an enchanted home. God, however, remains the largest possible agent and arena. And all the old stories are best and most credible. It's the psychological historical effect that I was talking about. And then I go back to my conversation with Andy and why I do this. And why, again, I said at the beginning of the video, some days I have to talk myself back into my faith, back into my job, back into Sunday after Sunday with some kind of credibility and authenticity, standing up and telling those people to lay down their life for a man who lived 2,000 years ago. Why do I do it? Well, there's been a new homeless woman hanging around, and she's not participating in the same reality the rest of us are. I don't know if she'll be here a day or a week or a year or 5 years. That's the way it goes with these things. And I got to know her name. I'll get to know her story, help her out with some things, hopefully not be too helpful that we enable, and you start the whole new dance. And we're the people at the corner where the romance meets the road. And it's not for the brightest, and it's not for the wealthiest, and it's not for the beautiful people, and it's not for the celebrities. It's for regular people that this world just crushes. Because it does crush. Every day I watch people get crushed. Not literally, not physically, but I watch the burdens of mental illness, the burdens of poverty, the burdens of their own foolishness compounded with years of foolishness, one onto another. Now you can listen to me via YouTube, but we're the people on the corner who are trying to be Jesus. And we're there for people who are woke and people who are anti-woke and all the 80% in between. And we're there for people who are homeless and people who have jobs and cars and reputations. And we sit and we listen. And we do a lot of listening because we know if we give them advice, they're probably not going to do it anyway because their mind is made up. And what they really come to do is just to be loved and to be listened to and to be known. And that's what a church planter or a pastor does. And sometimes I wish I had the power of Jesus to just release someone from demonic possession, maybe woke demonic or anti-woke demonic or mental health demons or what have you. If Jesus gave me that kind of power, if you listen to my sermon on Sunday, it's James and John who want to smoke a Samaritan village, and then Jesus sends the 72 out. And I think, is that a good idea? Give me miraculous power, I'd probably mess up the world something horrible. Plenty of movies make that point. But what I do is I sit and listen. We might not be the primary sense makers. but we are the front line of love. And we don't always know how to do that. As people get in real messes where love isn't easy. And how love works with the institution isn't easy. But that's the only tool we got. It's the most powerful tool of all. It's the only tool we got.